never thought a cemetery could be the most peaceful place in my life. Most people avoid them. They think they're creepy. But after my grandfather passed away in the spring of 2024, the cemetery became the only place where my mind felt quiet. He practically raised me. My parents divorced when I was young, and while they spent years arguing over everything, my grandfather was the one who always showed up. Every Saturday we'd fish together, watch old Western movies, or work on his beat-up pickup truck. Losing him felt like losing the last stable person in my life. For months after the funeral, I visited his grave every Tuesday and Thursday after work. I'd bring a folding chair, sit beside the headstone, and talk. It probably sounds strange, but it helped. At least, until I met her. The first time I noticed the woman, she was standing about 30 feet away near another grave. She looked completely normal. Mid-40s, dark curly hair, wearing a long gray coat, even though it wasn't that cold. She smiled when our eyes met. I nodded politely before looking back at my grandfather's grave. A few minutes later, I heard her laughing. Not a small laugh. It was loud. Like someone had just told the funniest joke she'd ever heard. When I looked over again, she was still alone. She was looking down at the headstone while carrying on a full conversation. I figured she was grieving in her own way. Everyone deals with loss differently, so I ignored it. But after that day, I started seeing her every single time I visited. Sometimes she'd wave before I even got out of my car. Sometimes she'd smile and say, "Good to see you again," even though I'd never told her my name. That should have been enough to make me leave. Instead, I convinced myself she was just friendly, and that was my first mistake. One Thursday afternoon, I pulled into the cemetery just before sunset. She was already there, standing beside the same weathered headstone. The moment I stepped out of my truck, she looked up and smiled. "You're later than usual." I froze. I had never told her what days I came. I laughed awkwardly and asked, "Do we know each other?" She tilted her head. "No, but people have routines." That answer didn't sit right with me. Still, I tried to brush it off. I walked over to my grandfather's grave and sat down. For almost 20 minutes, she stayed where she was. I could feel her glancing in my direction every few seconds. Eventually, she walked over. "I'm sorry if I've been bothering you," she said softly. "My husband is buried here. Talking helps." Her voice sounded calm, almost comforting. I nodded. "I understand." She asked about my grandfather. Without thinking, I told her everything. How he raised me, how I inherited his small farmhouse after he passed away, how I'd recently moved in because it reminded me of him. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she smiled. "He must have loved you very much." I thanked her. Then she quietly walked back to her grave. That conversation lasted less than 10 minutes. I wish it had never happened. The following week, I decided to change my routine. Instead of visiting after work, I went on Sunday morning. I pulled into the cemetery. No cars, no visitors, just silence. For the first time in weeks, I felt relaxed. I spent half an hour talking to my grandfather before heading home. As I drove toward the exit, I noticed the woman. She wasn't at the same grave anymore. She was standing near another visitor, smiling and talking just like she had with me. Something about that bothered me. Almost like she wasn't there to visit anyone. She was there to meet people. I tried not to think about it. A few nights later, I went out with some coworkers. By the time I got home, it was almost 1 a.m. As I parked in my driveway, something immediately felt wrong. A light was on upstairs. I always turned every light off before leaving. Always. Maybe I'd forgotten. That's what I kept telling myself. But my stomach disagreed. I unlocked the front door as quietly as I could. The house was silent, too silent. Then, I heard a drawer slide shut upstairs. Someone was inside. Every instinct told me to run. Instead, I slowly stepped behind the wall near the staircase and pulled out my phone. Just before I dialed 911, I heard footsteps, slow, careful, coming down the stairs. I held my breath. The footsteps stopped only a few feet away. Then a woman's voice whispered, "I know you're home." I didn't move, not even an inch. My phone was shaking so badly in my hand that I nearly dropped it. The house was completely silent again. For a few seconds, I convinced myself I had imagined the voice. Then I heard a soft laugh. It wasn't loud. It wasn't hysterical. It was quiet, like someone trying not to be heard. The footsteps started again, slow, one step at a time. I carefully leaned forward just enough to peek around the corner. The moment I saw her, my blood ran cold. It was the woman from the cemetery. She was holding one of my grandfather's old framed photographs. She wasn't looking at the picture. She was staring directly toward the hallway where I was hiding. I immediately pulled my head back. Had she seen me? I couldn't tell. Then she started talking. At first I thought she was on the phone, but there was no phone. She spoke as if another person was standing beside her. "See? I told you he'd come back." She paused, as though someone had answered. Then she smiled. "I like this house. It's peaceful." Another pause. "I think he'll let us stay." A chill shot through my entire body. There was no one else in the room. She was talking to empty air. A few seconds later, her voice changed. She began whispering so quietly I couldn't understand the words. Then, without warning, she burst into loud laughter. The sound echoed through the house. Just as suddenly the laughter stopped. She stood perfectly still. Her head slowly turned toward the hallway again. "I know you're hiding." Every muscle in my body locked up. I covered my mouth to stop myself from breathing too loudly. She took a few slow steps toward the hallway. Each footstep sounded louder than the last. 10 feet away, 8, 6. Then, a loud vibration came from my pocket. My phone. The sudden sound broke the silence. She froze for one horrifying second. Neither of us moved. Then she smiled. "There you are." She started walking toward me. I didn't wait. I sprinted through the back door, nearly falling down the porch steps as I dialed 911. I kept running until I reached my neighbor's house. By the time police arrived only minutes later, the woman was gone. The back window had been forced open from the inside. She had escaped before officers searched the property. Nothing valuable was missing. No cash, no jewelry, no electronics. The only thing she had taken was the framed photograph of me and my grandfather. The police searched the area for hours but never found her. The next afternoon, I returned to the cemetery with one of the detectives. I pointed toward the grave where she always stood. The detective looked at the headstone, then looked back at me. "Are you sure this is the one?" I nodded. He brushed leaves away from the faded inscription. The name on the stone wasn't the name she had told me. In fact, according to the cemetery records, no one had been buried there for over 60 years. Whoever she claimed to be visiting never existed. And somehow, that frightened me even more than finding her inside my house. The detective asked me one question before we left. "Did you tell her anything personal?" At first I said no. Then it hit me. I had told her about inheriting my grandfather's farmhouse. I had even mentioned it was only 15 minutes from the cemetery. I never gave her the address. But in a small town, that was probably enough. The police believed she had simply followed me home one day without me noticing. That explanation made sense, at least until a week later. One of the detectives called me. "We found something that belongs to you." I drove to the station immediately. He placed a clear evidence bag on the desk. Inside was the framed photograph that had disappeared from my house. The glass was cracked, but the picture itself was untouched. "Where did you find it?" I asked. The detective hesitated. "It was left at your grandfather's grave early this morning. A groundskeeper had discovered it, leaning against the headstone before sunrise. No cameras in that section of the cemetery had captured anyone leaving it there. After that, I stopped visiting for several months. Grief was easier to handle than fear. Eventually, I forced myself to go back. It was a bright Saturday afternoon. Families were visiting loved ones. Fresh flowers covered many of the graves. For the first time in a long while, the cemetery felt Normal. I placed new flowers beside my grandfather's headstone. "I'm sorry I stayed away," I whispered. As I stood up to leave, something caught my eye across the cemetery near the old oak trees. A woman in a long gray coat was standing perfectly still. She wasn't looking at a grave. She was looking at me, even from that distance. I recognized the smile. I blinked. A family walked between us. When they passed, she was gone. I searched every path, every row of headstones. There was no sign of her. The cemetery staff told me they hadn't seen anyone matching my description all day. I never reported that sighting. No one would have believed me anyway. A year has passed since then. I still live in my grandfather's house. I installed security cameras, stronger locks, and motion lights around the property. Nothing unusual has happened since, but every few weeks someone leaves a single white lily on my grandfather's grave. The cemetery staff has no idea who leaves it, neither do I. I haven't seen the woman again, and I hope I never do, because deep down, I don't think she was looking for a place to mourn. I think she was looking for someone to follow.